Hello everyone, on this edition of the Ottawa Market, we talk about I don't know if it's a controversy, but the debate between the F-35 and the Saab-Gripens. Particularly, I want to focus on today on how this debate between the Lockheed Martin's planes, military jet aircraft, and the Saab-Gripens, they are showing us a fundamental problem when it comes to Canadian sovereignty and our ability as Canadians to defend ourselves against Trump's annexation threats. Now, one thing that many Canadians might notice, and this is an article example, is former Canadian military officers urge Ottawa to buy the Gripens and proceed with F-35 buy. Now, that seems to be an innocent enough article. I mean, one might think, well, maybe these Canadian military officers just think the F-35s are better. And at the same time, we need to acknowledge that there's many Canadians out there, perhaps the majority, think that, well, maybe in light of Trump's annexation threats, we should be focusing on multilateralism. The Sweden took the time to come here. There are various government officials, and Saab-Gripen seems to be a solid military aircraft. Maybe we should lesser our dependence on the United States and Trump's crazy vagaries and focus on building our multilateralism with Sweden. Well, why do these military officers keep harping on the need to buy these F-35s? And again, there's a big reason for this, which I'll be focusing on in terms of why there is this, urging of the need to buy these F-35s. So this is basically the problem here. Now, the problem here is that we as Canadians think that we have an independent military. We conceive of ourselves as having an independent Royal Canadian Air Force, an independent Army, and an independent Navy. But this is not the case. Because of NORAD, NORAD puts Canada under a unified military command structure. And, so that's the big situation. So if we look at who is in charge of NORAD, who is the general commander of NORAD? Well, the general commander of NORAD, according to this Google review, is a General Gregory M. Guilot of the United States Air Force. We have a situation there basically that the NORAD is under a U.S. military commander. So we have a situation here that NORAD, for example, is much different than NATO. NATO is based upon independent militaries coming together through a collective deterrence of aggressors. Each country has its own control over its own armed forces, particularly with respect to the Air Force. In NORAD, it's not the case. NORAD is a unified command structure, and this is why some weeks ago the U.S. military jet was, because of some problem happening in Canada, the U.S. military jet was allowed to fly into Canadian airspace, because of the United States exercising control over Canadian airspace through NORAD. So this is what's going on here. What's going on here is that these Canadian officers, under the control of a U.S. military commander, are expressing their allegiance not to, our independence as Canadians or what we should be doing as an independent country, but based upon their apparent loyalties to a U.S.-controlled military command structure under the control of an United States Air Force, which operates under the control of the Commander-in-Chief of the United States, President Trump. So this, in my view, explains why we have Canadian military officers all apparently coming into line and wanting the F-35, because this is what their loyalties direct them to do if they are required under the military command structure to be loyal to their commander their military commander. Their military commander is not substantively Carney, is not substantively the Canadian government. The military commanders, which the Canadian military personnel and their ex-military personnel are responding to, is there an allegiance system which encourages Canadian military officers to be loyal to a U.S.-controlled, a substantively U.S.-controlled military command structure, which is NORAD. So, when we talk about, our threats to our sovereignty, the threats that are posed by, the Trump wanting to so-called annex Canada, it's a real threat when we have a command structure which is we don't control, substantively. It is controlled through a U.S. territorial command structure which allows for military planes and military personnel at their own discretion to fly and to interfere with Canadian space, whether we want it or like it or not. So if we are going to talk about sovereignty, we are going to need to start to discuss, and this is not something which you hear about in the Canadian media. This is not something which is being talked about by politicians. We need to, first of all, evaluate to what extent NORAD is compromising the ability of our military personnel and our ex-military personnel to be loyal to Canada and not to be loyal to a U.S. political military industrial complex, because the whole F-35 deal is going to be supportive to a U.S. military political industrial complex, and this is what NORAD is serving by its current structure. So if we are going to have a NORAD and acknowledge that NORAD is an important institution, shouldn't we as Canadians work with the United States based upon a separate military command structure where Canadians and Americans come together, but without this unified structure which requires our military personnel to be respondent to, not to us as Canadians, but to be respondent to a U.S. Air Force controlled command structure, which in turn responds to the U.S. Commander-in-Chief? Shouldn't we have an independent military so that we have NORAD based upon a Canadian commander and a U.S. commander, separate, but working in cooperation with one another in the defense of North America, not Canadians having to be, and our personnel having to be working under the thumb of a U.S. Air Force, a U.S. command system that puts us in a subservient capacity to United States in a way which is going to cloud the judgment of our U.S. military personnel, deciding on what planes and what contracts that the Canadian government should be pursuing or not. We should not have. Do you think, and so this is the question for everybody to consider, do you think that NORAD as it stands right now should be left? Should you think that this is serving the needs of Canadians? Do you think that, or do you think that NORAD having a unified command structure under the control of the United States Air Force and the President of the United States as the Commander-in-Chief, do you think that that is going to fundamentally affect the judgment of our military personnel when it comes to decisions regarding whether we should be pursuing the F-35 jets or whether we should be pursuing Saab-Gripen? What do you think? Do you think that everything should be left alone and, NORAD is quite fine and there's no threat to Canadian sovereignty and this is all, ridiculous? Or do you think that NORAD, we need to look at NORAD, the Canadian government, the current government? Do you think that we need to re-examine the role of NORAD and its role in Canadian sovereignty and restructure NORAD in a way where our military personnel is completely separate from U.S. military personnel and that we can have completely unquestioned control over our military forces and our airspace in a way which does not put us in any vulnerable situation of allowing U.S. military craft and other military personnel to go into Canadian airspace without our permission. Should we? So, what do you think about this? NORAD. What do you think that? Do you think that we should just leave it alone, or do you think that it needs to be revised to serve the desires of Canadians to affirm their sovereignty, affirm our sovereignty as a nation, protect us from threat of annexation? Do we need to look at this? So, and do you think that the ability of Canadian military personnel to be able to make a sober judgment on whether the Saab-Gripens are in our interests or not relative to the F-35? Do you think that the NORAD structure is compromising the ability of our military to make sound judgments and to advise the Canadian government accordingly? Thanks for watching another edition of the Ottawa Market, and we look forward to your debates and your insights and everybody, and what you think NORAD represents. Do you think it is great? Do you think this is just fine? Or do you think that it is in its current form not serving the needs of Canadians concerning Canadian sovereignty and our desires to resist the Trump's annexation threats? What do you think? Thanks for watching, and like and subscribe this channel if you're interested in more debate, participating more commentaries like the one today concerning the Saab-Gripen and how does that relate to NORAD and our desires to maintain our sovereignty as a nation. Thanks for watching.